Shortly after 7 a.m. on June 4, 1942, USS Enterprise launched its two dive bomber squadrons, Scouting 6 and Bombing 6. Once assembled, these 32 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers went in search of the Japanese carrier task force. This was it. This was the moment when the U.S. Pacific Fleet attempted to spring its trap and get revenge for Pearl Harbor. But it almost didn't happen. For 2 hours, the two dive bomber squadrons cruised high above the clouds, flying at 190 knots, 20,000 feet above the Earth. At 9:20, when the planes reached the predicted intercept point, they found nothing but an empty ocean. The task force admirals had wildly misjudged where the Japanese fleet would be. Enterprise's Air Group commander, Clarence Wade McCluskey, realized he had a choice to make. He could scrub the mission and return to base, or he could keep searching, potentially threatening the lives of his pilots if their planes ran out of gas. McCluskey understood the consequences. Running out of fuel meant ditching, and if the crews survived a water landing, they might run the risk of being lost at sea. The pilots had orders to observe absolute radio silence, which meant that they couldn't use their radios even under emergency circumstances. That scenario became real indeed when an SBD piloted by Ensign Tony Schneider had to ditch due to engine trouble. As Schneider's plane splashed into the waves 4 miles below, his comrades wondered if they would share his fate. When it became obvious that the Japanese fleet was nowhere in sight, McCluskey signaled with his hands that he intended to keep searching, even if it meant stretching his air group's fuel supply. All the pilots knew what this meant. All of them had to be willing to find the enemy fleet or die trying. Lieutenant J.G. Jack Dusty Cleese was a 26-year-old pilot in Scouting 6. He remembered how he felt about McCluskey's decision to keep searching.
I was worried about our chances of survival. My fuel gauge was already below the halfway point. If we went ahead with the attack, we would certainly use plenty of fuel diving against the ships, taking evasive action and regaining our altitude. If we survived the attack, we were not permitted to return to our carrier directly. Instead, we had orders to dogleg, flying in another direction for 40 miles or so before turning for home, so the enemy would have no idea from which direction we had come. All this flying would consume more fuel. It appeared doubtful that we would ever return to our carrier. What would happen to any pilot who risked an attack and then ran out of fuel? A crashed aircrew could take a chance of being picked up by a patrol plane eventually, but that was 1 chance in 100. I guess any one of us could have jettisoned our bombs and returned to Enterprise, but this was unthinkable to me and to my comrades. It would have been cowardice. We were determined to make good on our one shot at the enemy fleet that had inflicted such misery on Allied forces since December 7. We had trained too long and too hard to back out now. We knew we might run out of fuel and die a horrible, lonely death on the ocean, but it did not matter. We made our decision quickly and automatically. We decided to attack. We had to attack. We had to win.
Then, at 9:47, McCluskey's persistence paid off. The dive bomber pilots found a lone Japanese destroyer, the Urashi, which had detached from the Japanese fleet earlier in the day. Thinking it was a liaison ship, the pilots turned in the direction it was heading. It led them straight to the Japanese fleet. At 10:15, the Imperial Japanese Navy came into view, some 20 vessels, spread out over a distance of 10 miles. 2 massive carriers, Kaga and Kaga, were right in the path of McCluskey's group. Another Scouting 6 pilot, Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson, recalled the scene.
I could see a huge fleet, so many ships that I knew it was their main body. This was the culmination of our hopes and dreams. Among those ships, I could see 2 long yellow rectangles, the flight decks of carriers. That yellow stood out on the dark blue sea like nothing you have ever seen. I could not understand why we had come this far without having fighters swarming over us and around us like hornets. But we hadn't seen a single fighter in the air, and not a shot had been fired at us.
Due to previous attacks made by the American torpedo squadrons, the Japanese fighter planes were scattered at low altitude. The dive bombers had an uninterrupted path to the Japanese fleet. When they were only a few miles from Akagi and Kaga, McCluskey shouted orders into the radio, directing Scouting 6 to go after the portside carrier, while Bombing 6 went after the one to starboard. Speaking to Scouting 6's commander, Lieutenant Earl Gallagher, McCluskey barked, "All planes attack! Earl, you follow me." With that, McCluskey led the way, and the rest of Scouting 6 followed him down. Dusty Cleese attacked Kaga, plummeting downward in a long string of aircraft 7 planes behind Commander McCluskey. He remembered his dive vividly.
Our attack began at 10:23. I said to myself, "Here we go," and then threw the stick forward. My plane rolled into its dive, and in a few seconds, all I could see was the enormous blue ocean coming at me, with a smoking enemy carrier in the middle of it. As I have often said, diving in an SBD makes the scariest roller coaster on the planet seem like child's play. The winds roared loudly around my cockpit, and my plane knifed downward at 240 knots. The rising sun emblem on Kaga's bow made an inviting target, so I used it to sight my bombs. By now, Kaga's gunners fired everything they had at us. Providentially, not a single nugget of that hellish hail touched my plane. I wanted to assure myself of a hit, so I released my bombs at 1,000 feet. This was my lowest dive ever. I pulled sharply on the stick. I felt the awful, gut-crunching sensation of 9 Gs squeezing my body. Sea spray speckled my windshield. I prefer not to guess how close I'd come to plunging into the ocean. My gunner, John Snowden, saw what happened immediately. My 500-pounder slammed into Kaga's forward elevator, right at the edge of the big red circle where I had aimed. The bomb penetrated Kaga's upper hangar and exploded below the flight deck. My pair of incendiary bombs went in too, igniting fueled and armed aircraft spotted below. It produced a frightful inferno from which the carrier never recovered.
In 5 minutes' time, the SBDs from Scouting 6 and Bombing 6 had wrecked Kaga and Akagi, turning them into smoking volcanoes full of fire and death. Meanwhile, one of USS Yorktown's dive bomber squadrons arrived on the scene and attacked the carrier Soryu, mortally damaging it as well. By 10:28, the attack was over, and 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers were on fire and exploding. Secondary eruptions made it impossible for the Japanese sailors to carry out any repairs. The 3 carriers were doomed. As he flew away from the scene, Lieutenant Clarence Dickinson recalled the sight of the spectacular pyrotechnics unleashed by Kaga as the ship underwent its death rattle.
The 3 biggest fires were the carriers. They were burning fiercely and exploding. I looked back when I was a couple of miles away. This was no more than a few minutes after my bombs had landed on the Kaga. She was on fire from end to end, and I saw her blow up at the middle. From right abreast the island, a ball of solid fire shot straight up. It passed through the fleecy lower clouds, which we estimated to be at 1,200 feet above the water. Some of our flyers who were higher saw this solid mass of fire as it burst up through the clouds, and they said the fire rose 300 or 400 feet still higher. Probably that was gasoline, but many of the explosions I was seeing in those 3 carriers were, I think, from their own bombs parked below on the hangar decks in readiness for planes to be rearmed.
On all 3 carriers, the damage was beyond repair. Later that afternoon, American dive bombers repeated their success, pummeling a 4th carrier, the Hiryu. In their moment of opportunity, the U.S. Navy's dive bombers made their shots count. To them, the Navy owes an everlasting debt of gratitude.